The Idries Shah Foundation podcast. Practical psychology for today. Featuring the works of Idries Shah, narrated by David Ault. Welcome to the Idries Shah Foundation podcast. In this edition of the podcast, we will hear selections from Sufi Thought and Action by Idries Shah. This audio is made available by the Idries Shah Foundation. Sufi Principles, Action Learning Methods, Imitators, Meeting Places, and the Western Seeker by Humayun Abbas and others. Trust by Humayun Abbas. Trust is not something caused, it is something developed. That is to say, what is called trust when it is slowly taught to animals by men who tame them is not trust, but reliance. Real trust is different. Trust in God, too, is not taught to human beings by God. On the contrary, God gives men so many reasons to have lack of trust, calamities, uncertainties, loss of hope, that it could be said that God actually illustrates that trust in something or someone beneficial is not to be erected on happiness or good experiences alone. Similarly, the Sufi master does not pose as someone worthy of trust in the sense that clerics and others make sure that their externals and their behavior inspire the trust which is reliance. Such trust as the latter kind is only to be regarded as worthwhile if it has been tested. For this reason the Sufis have asked, how many friends would you have if you went from one to another asking them to conceal a dead body? Trust is something which the Sufi postulant must find from within himself, in spite of what the superficialities seem to indicate. This is one reason that Sufi masters have even made themselves appear ridiculous or untrustworthy to intending disciples. No less a person than Sheikh Shibli said, when approached by someone who wanted to be accepted as a student, "Repeat, there is no God but God, and Shibli is his prophet." This in order to test whether his submission was servile or otherwise. One of the commonest manifestations of lack of trust in a teacher, constantly emphasized by Sufi masters, is when the disciple expects attention and instructions when he has not done what he should do as a precondition of these things. Sheikh Ajal Shirazi, as only one example of this important aspect of Sufism, spoke thus to an applicant who came in search of zikrs or litanies. Do not allow for others what you will not allow for yourself. Desire for others what you desire for yourself. Some time later, this same man arrived at the master's door, asking for recitations to be given to him, saying that, after all, he was the sheikh's disciple. "How can I give you the second lesson," asked the master, "when you have not observed the first one?" One of the most important aspects of the conception of trust is that this technical term implies an activity and a posture which, in turn, developed a capacity in the individual. Monks and others, including spiritual recluses, have spent whole lifetimes obsessed by the conception of trust, and thus been unable to pass to a further stage. In the teachings quoted by Hujwiri, Kashf al-Majub, this problem is illustrated by the account of Hallaj instructing the eminent Ibrahim Khawas. When Hallaj went to Kufa, he was visited by Khawas. Hallaj asked Khawas, "O Ibrahim, what have you obtained from your 2 decades of study of the Sufis?" Khawas said, "I have concentrated upon the doctrine of trust." Hallaj said, "You have wasted time in cultivating the spiritual. Where is the annihilation in unification?" Hujwiri explains that trust signifies an attitude and a reliance. If a man spends his whole life in remedying his spiritual nature, he will need another life for remedying his material nature, and his life will be lost before he has found a trace or vestige of God. The story of Sheikh Shirazi, given above, also underlines another characteristic of trust which is emphasized by the Sufi masters. People who cannot trust are themselves not trustworthy, and therefore cannot be entrusted with important things. The would-be disciple of Shirazi did not trust him to attend to the disciple's needs when they were manifested. In his turn, the intending disciple could not be trusted to exercise the attitudes which were prescribed for him at the first meeting. The disciple who asked Shirazi for further guidance was not exercising trust, as we have seen, but he may well have thought that he was asking the master to give him a trust, having failed to perceive that he had been given the first lesson before he could get the second. Indeed, trust is only the fourth stage of one version of the Sufi journey. The first is repentance, taubat, from objectionable things. The second is inabat, returning to rightness. The third is renunciation, zud, and then comes trust. The master's assessment of the applicant, put in terms of do not allow for others what you would not allow for yourself, desire for others what you desire for yourself, clearly covers the practices which would constitute these first three stages. The instructions given to a student by the master constitute the practice or practices necessary for him to complete the station, maqam, in which he is to stand. Hence, in the words of Hujwiri, the disciple must abide by this stage, and his fulfillment of the obligations appertaining to that station, and his keeping it until he comprehends its perfection so far as lies in man's power. It is not permissible that he should quit his station without fulfilling the obligations thereof. Although the intending Sufi will have to trust his mentor sufficiently to accept his instructions as to the three stations which come before it, he will not be capable of real trust until he has completed the fourth. Nevertheless, there is sufficient capacity in students to exercise this limited trustworthiness. Trust itself, as Al-Ghazali has defined it, is made up of knowledge, state, and work, called in Sufi technical terms ilm, hal, and amal. These three things constitute the attunement of the learner to that which has to be learnt. When a Sufi master is coaching disciples, whether by words, signs, or actions, he is preparing them to apply the attitude which is composed of these. The coaching of disciples, to wean them from appearances, automatism, and reliance upon literalism, has a very long history among the Sufis, and may be regarded as a central requirement. Indeed, the ordinary person's certainty that seeing is believing has to be replaced for the Sufi by a greater flexibility of understanding before extra dimensions of the mind may be opened up. Sir Richard Burton tells the story of the great Sufi master Bayazid and the courtesan. Bayazid's disciples revered him so much at the expense of what he was teaching that he decided that this conditioning would have to be broken. Men, as the Sufi saying has it, should not be respected at the expense of what they represent. One day Bayazid was surrounded by a group of admiring followers who were wedded to the belief that piety was inseparable from appearance. Bayazid sent a message to a woman of ill fame to bring him some of his clothes which he had left with her, and to send an account of the money which he owed her. Similarly, Shamsuddin of Tabriz, teacher of Rumi, once asked a disciple, as a test, to lend him his wife. This necessary technique has caused imitators to claim that they are Sufi masters, and encouraged such people to deceive and defraud others. But the argument put forward in some circles that the practice should not therefore be allowed is not valid, for at least two reasons. The first is that, over the centuries, the ill effects of pretended Sufis have not been shown to cause intolerable havoc, any more than the impostures of other miscreants. The second is that to invoke this principle is, in the words of a modern master, like forbidding free speech because villains might misuse it. An examination of the words and deeds of such Sufi masters as we have noted above, as well as the time spent among the Sufis of the present day, abundantly show that 1. Trust is not civility. People tend to misunderstand trust. 2. Trust is needed before lessons can be learnt. 3. The kind of trust which is needed is stimulated by the master. 4. The master may stimulate this by words or action or writings. 5. Before this stage there are other stages, similarly stimulated. 5. Many people imagine that they seek knowledge, when in reality they only seek attention or something else which they have in the back of their minds. 7. The Sufi, knowing his would-be disciple, gives him or her instructions which both prepare him or her and also enable him or her and others to see whether the process is working, firstly by helping to reveal the true nature of the student's attitudes. And 8. The learner comes to appreciate that the Sufi is rejecting certain kinds of approach and encouraging others, in order to help to bring the disciple's spiritual, not selfish, nature to bear on the problem of progress. In the words of Rumi, the master will not allow the disciple's self-conceit to operate so that he is left on the teacher's hands like government soap. It is because he can appear to touch defilement and yet not be defiled, Anwari, that the master Sufi can afford to behave in a way which society does not readily allow to others. Nothing, said Abu Turab al-Naqshbandi, can defile the Sufi, and he in fact purifies everything. Among the modern exponents of the Way who have made the first stages possible through speech and publishing is the Afghan adept Idries Shah, whose works are appreciated in the East and West. In the past, such writers as Ghazali, 10th and 11th centuries, or Hujwiri, 11th century, and Rumi, 13th century, used the method of tales, arguments, and discourses to provide the preliminary steps for the learner, to enable him to approach the stage of dervish, one who is on the path. Later Sufis, while continuing this process, have often allowed private visits, attendance at lectures, and personal instruction to help carry the study further. The great expansion of printing and reading in the past few centuries, which have made possible a wide distribution of the earlier classics, have not completely succeeded in teaching postulants that they should prepare themselves for what the teacher in the flesh can convey by a careful study of his written work. It is still therefore very common for people to behave in the same way as the would-be disciple of the Master Shirazi, seeking the second lesson before absorbing the first. One of the means adopted to stratify the steps for admission and progress in a graduated succession were the Sufist orders, which came into being in the Middle Ages. Unfortunately, with the passage of time, these have always concentrated upon a reductionist interpretation of the Way, instead of a personal and flexible one, characteristic of institutionalization. The demise of the orders as effective learning channels, however, has not abolished the teaching function, but only transferred it from the orders back to the traditional masters. Sufi Activity. Emir Ali Khan. In the world, not of it. The members of all communities, including nations and whole civilizations, are infused with the prevailing ideologies of those communities. These, in turn, create attitudes of mind which include certain capacities and, equally positively, exclude others. The ideologies may be so ancient, so deep-seated, or so subtle that they are not identified as such by the people at large. In this case, they are often discerned only through a method of challenging them, asking questions about them, or by comparing them with other communities. Such challenge, description, or questioning, often the questioning of assumptions, is what frequently enables a culture or a number of people from that culture to think in ways that have been closed to most of their fellows. Traditionally, the Sufis have adopted the method of challenge and response to assist people to enlarge their development and increase their perceptions. Naturally, the challenge is not random, not challenge for the sake of challenge, or questioning in order to be destructive, or even description just to add to the sum total of information, but is, in its specificity, calculated to lead to an advance in the level of individual and communal knowledge. Burn that bar. Depth and character of Sufi potential. Just as the mere adoption of Sufi externals does not help in any higher development, so is the only way to this development through the actual experiencing of sensations which do not resemble any others in ordinary human experience. The Sufic current, it may be added, cannot be mixed with any other. Those who attempt to do this are only trying to achieve mixing on an emotional level, which is contraindicated in Sufi work. It is very common for those who have not been in contact with a legitimate Sufi school to try to amalgamate Sufi ideas, techniques, and so on with other thoughts and behavior patterns. This attempt in itself is evidence of low-level understanding, which must be transcended before the school can communicate effectively with such an individual. The chief barrier to equal contact with the Sufi experience is the overdevelopment or overuse of imagination. As the Sufi teacher Rumi puts it, imagination blocks you like a bolt on a door. Burn that bar. The next obstacle in the harmonization of the Sufis with those who would participate in their experience lies in the chaotic situation which exists in all societies, when the prevailing ideology, whether scholastic, religious, or other, has removed the distinction between the three main kinds of knowledge, general, specialized, and perceptive, as applied to human development. It is always a sign of a legitimate Sufi school when it attempts to restore these levels in study, just as it is a sign of a deteriorated tradition when the levels are not fully recognized by a community. The three kinds of knowledge. One of the most specific statements of these three levels was made by Al-Ghazali. Everyone, he taught, is, in reality, in one of three categories in respect to knowledge. First, he is a sharer in the general stock of knowledge and what is called knowledge by the community in which he lives. The larger social world of his family, tribe, nation, civilization. Second, he may enter the ranks of those who understand more, who specialize. Third, he can enter the circle of those who have a realization of understanding through direct experience. These three levels are found, for instance, in the general idea of, say, being a blacksmith, then of learning how to become a blacksmith, and finally the experience of actually being a blacksmith. In the levels recognized in the Islamic spiritual philosophical tradition, the three circles correspond with the law, shariat, the path, tariqat, and knowledge, ma'arifat. Die before you die. Sufi teaching is designed to accept the learner at level 1, and help him or her by means of the work of level 2 to reach level 3. Level 3 is that which is conceived as beyond the sleep, Hakim Sanai and others, which is familiar life. It is the existence in which the human phase of being is only a part, and which can be seen as an interruption or stage, as sleep may be viewed as an interruption of wakefulness. Hence the slogan, "Die before you die," which means that stage 3 is the experiencing, before the end of ordinary human life, of the perennial existence which follows physical death. Do you need a furnace or a lamp? Like any other legitimate teaching, the Sufi way gives the student not what he or she may desire, but whatever is indicated as useful to enable the passage from stage 1 to stage 3 to take place. This concentration upon specificity in progress is what distinguishes the Sufis from a cult or from any other form of self-indulgence purporting to be a way. Seek a furnace, but it would burn you, says Rumi, continuing, you only need the flame of a lamp. In cults and other activities designed for pleasure rather than progress, the sensation is what is sought, and the most intense one at that. The school, however, seeks enlightenment, not intensity. It is to the individual and the group which have decided to seek something through such unregenerate and ignorant ambition that Sadi speaks when he says, I fear that you will never reach Mecca, O nomad, for you are on the road to Turkestan. The common occurrence of cults which imitate some Sufi techniques, remaining at stage 1 while they think they are approaching the third stage, is thus styled by Hafiz, another major teacher. A man must be Solomon before his magical ring will work. Organization. The Sufi method of organization has a discernible pattern insofar as studies are concerned. This is as follows. The Sufi teacher presides over his own circle, the halqa. Next comes the group, the taifa. This is presided over by the deputy. Finally comes the individual membership, in which single individuals are linked to the teaching through the office, daira. The totality of the membership is the tariqa, the path, school, often inaccurately called, in imitation of Western organizations, the order. The important point to remember in relation to the different forms of membership is that they are all considered to be equally important. In degenerate and imitation schools, comprising people who do not understand the workings of a school, it is considered better to belong to the master's circle than to be a mere individual member. Such imaginings are borrowed from the first level area of primitive human organization and have no place in a school. The teacher, or the society, Jamiyat, authorized by him, attaches students and other members in accordance with an expert assessment to one or other forms of relationship, individual, circle, group, which may be varied from time to time to provide the necessary learning impulses. Since incomers generally have only the standards of stage 1 as their opinion-forming instrument, it is common for some of them to demand to enter groups or circles, or to be individual members, or not to be such. People who adopt such an attitude are taken as valuing their assumptions above the expertise of the society, and are generally discarded by the organization which, in Sufi terminology, does not feel itself competent to deal with them. Terminology. In a Sufi school, the only Sufis are the realized end products. The Sufi, according to classical and legitimate definition, is the illuminate. To call oneself a Sufi, therefore, is incorrect. People who do so are not Sufis. People who do not may or may not be Sufis. Members, if they are part of self-organized groups or self-styled seekers, are known as dervishes, the poor, and sometimes form themselves into study groups or reading circles pending acceptance by a regular school. In some cases, such bodies of students fail to obtain recognition, and their amateur schools may continue to exist even for centuries, being, in reality, cults or amusement bodies, though undetected as such in the community at large, which is generally only aware of Level 1 activity. Such organizations are even considered to be Sufi bodies, and scholars and others regularly study them in the mistaken belief that they constitute a part of the Sufi phenomenon. These groupings are usually identifiable because of their love of emotive names for themselves, for their dramatic ideas about truth or enlightenment, their attachment to symbols and other externals, and their excitable membership. In all these respects, they tend to be the opposite of the measured and effective Sufi group. A dervish group or individual, however, can possibly be attached usefully to a school, but generally such wide-ranging organization is needed as to upset the pleasures of the members, and hence the likelihood of such a development is not strong. Rumi is direct in saying of them, "Let us leave such donkeys to their pastures." This podcast is copyright 2018, the Idries Shah Foundation.